So you've killed your succulent. I'm going to talk about how I killed mine, why these easy plants aren't quite so easy, and we'll go a little bit into care and propagation too. First of all, I want to talk about why everybody says succulents are so easy. They always recommend succulents for beginners, and I don't necessarily think that they're a great beginner plant. First of all, I believe a lot of people recommend succulents because they require very little maintenance. And it's true, they don't require a lot of care. But I do think that there is a trick to them. And unless you know their specific requirements on how to take care of them, it's very easy to get wrinkled, leggy, burned, or just plain dead succulents. So let's define what a succulent is. A succulent is not a genus or a species of plant, it is a description. So technically, it is not any one type of plant, but a way to describe how a plant looks or survives. Succulent meaning that it is water retaining, whether it be through very juicy, thick leaves, or you could have water retention features in the stems of the plant in order to be very drought resistant. So when you hear someone talk about succulents, typically the type of plant that comes to mind is something that might look like this. Now there's all kinds of genus, families, species of different succulents or plants that have a succulent-like nature that can be very broad. But we're going to talk about this type of plant. Not just this one specifically, but something like this. Now, different succulents have different features that would describe it as a succulent. In this case, you can tell the leaves are very thick and juicy and have a squishy texture to it because it's retaining so much water. There might be some other species of succulents or succulent species that have more water retaining in the stems. So succulent species tend to be very drought resistant because they retain water. The whole point is that they're able to survive during very dry conditions or during periods of time of drought. So that's often why these fare very well in desert-like conditions or very warm climates because they're able to sustain life without having constant care. Well, for watering of these too, you want to take into consideration that they retain water, so you don't want to constantly pour more water on it. It's just going to drown your plant. Now, most species live in very rocky climates or areas where there is very little rain, so you would want to water extremely thoroughly, allow the water to drain through the soil medium, have a very well draining soil medium so that it's not sitting in the pot, and then allow a long period of time between waterings. Some species can go for weeks or even months without a watering, but you really want to be very specific to the plant and know what type of conditions it needs. Now, lighting conditions can vary greatly depending on the plant. Most succulent varieties love bright light, and I think in most cases can even handle direct sun, but they all have different features that allow it to handle different light conditions. Some succulent species of Peperomia tend to like a more medium to lower end of light, while others like a Crassula or Haworthia can handle almost full sun conditions. Now again, because every plant is so different, it's very important that you're actually researching each specific plant to understand what kind of light conditions it needs. Some will feature a more fuzzy-like texture, which is a natural resistance to burning. It protects the plant from receiving too much sun. Some have what are called fenestrations, which when we hear that word, we typically think of the holes, but actual fenestrations is a translation of the word window. So it creates a window through the leaf in order for it to absorb more light, for example. A lot of times when a plant has a water retaining feature to it, It's often because it can handle more extreme weather conditions, such as a hot summer or a very dry period of time. Now, pests can vary too. Pests can range anywhere from fungus gnats to mealybugs, thrips. You might find, what are they called? You might find scale on some of your plants. They really will be specific to that type of plant, but they do tend to attract pests because a lot of pests prefer to have those juicy leaves to nibble on. As far as troubleshooting goes, we'll kind of talk about a couple of really common things that happen with succulents. Probably the most common problem is overwatering, and typically signs of overwatering are yellowing leaves, mushy or rotting material or roots. You'll find browning, or you'll find a kind of soggy texture to the plant. And they're very sensitive to overwatering because the root system are too delicate or too sensitive to too much water. They require a lot of airflow and a lot of oxygen. And if they don't get that, you're probably going to get a dead plant. Another common problem would be sunburn. And again, you would think a succulent plant, you kind of automatically relate to a cactus and think it's like a cactus and you put it in the sun. But a lot of them can't handle full direct sun for a period of time. So you do have to make sure that you are giving it a little shade or some indirect light, but as bright as possible, because their nature is to absorb as much light as possible and to hold on to its energy versus letting that energy pass through it. So with succulent plants, I often just think too much can be a bad thing. Well, some succulent plants can actually be quite tricky, and a good example of that is a string of pearls. They tend to have a very specific water requirement, and if you don't water it exactly how it likes to be watered, it will let you know. And it will let you know through rotting stems, declining roots, and soggy little pearls. Now, there can be also a myriad of other problems that happen with your plant, and obviously you would need to research specifically what some of those symptoms are, reach out to some of your planty friends to find out what you can do to help it. But at least it kind of gives you an idea of what to look for and how to take care of your plant. So now let's talk about propagating. Sometimes I don't know what to do with my hands. We're just going to talk with my hands a lot. I'm sorry. So let's talk about propagating. I have come to find through my experience, and don't quote me on this because I'm probably not even close to the truth, but through my experience, every species of succulent that I have come across, I've been able to leaf propagate. And I think that's true in most cases, and I'm sure there's exceptions, but you can leaf propagate your succulents, and that's probably one of the easiest way to do it, besides division. So let's talk about leaf propagating. Now I have a burrow's tail that is constantly dropping leaves, and I never get rid of those leaves. I instead will lay them on a damp medium. Sphagnum moss is probably the best to use, but I happen to have this lying around, so I used this. But when you have a leaf that falls off, just place it directly on top, and as you can see, it will start to grow roots into your potting medium. Sorry, it's not focusing here. And then it will start to grow a whole new plant. And you do want to ensure that you're giving it moist conditions while it's in its propagating state to ensure that the leaf is getting moisture and nutrients and not just rotting and dying. But if you're patient enough, you can propagate any of your leaves and get an entire new plant. Now, if you're not sure what division propagating is, that's when you divide the plant by the root ball and you're separating it to make multiple plants. Now, that can be a little tricky with succulents, more so than like a tropical plant, and that's typically because the root systems are very sensitive or very fragile, and that can cause the roots to go into shock and often stop doing their job, and the plant will wither and die. So usually leaf propagating, even though it does take more time, is definitely a more secure and safe way of propagating your plant versus any type of root division or cut stem and prop. I brought you outside to show you some examples of succulents that I have successfully and not so successfully propagated. We have here little leaf stems that I had propagated into here, and although they are taking off, I am also noting it tends to be a little on the thirsty side, but they're growing and I'm quite excited about that. This crassula I had actually had a much bigger plant, but I had cut off the tops and propagated them into here and gave the mother plant to my mother. And so now I'm finally getting some new growth, but as you can see, some of this is not doing so well. So at least I have some success, and well, we'll just live with the not so successful parts. But we'll see how that does over some time. Now over here, I've had some more success. I actually had my wedding bouquet with succulents, and I managed to prop and grow the plants from my wedding bouquet. And so that has actually been a nice little souvenir. But these have all been stem cuttings that I've taken and propagated leaves, and now I'm finally getting some new growth, which is really exciting, as you can see. But generally, these type of plants tend to be slow growers if they're not given the exact type of lighting conditions they need. So it's something to keep in mind. When they do grow and they're not getting bright enough light, you're going to get some very leggy stems because the plant is going to be reaching out for more light. A really good example is this Ferrier, which is actually a Peperomia. You can see that it has some very leggy stems and has been dropping a lot of leaves, and I think that's mostly because of some cold weather. And this long flower-like stem that's coming out. Ooh, look at these flowers. This is a really long flower stem. But I think now that we're going to get some warmer weather and some brighter light, this should actually fare a lot better. And she's dusty too because she's outside. But this is also a jade plant that I have had for many years. And you'll notice has some very juicy leaves on it. And also has a little bit of sun damage, and that's mostly due to the fact that it had some very full sun, but now it is recovering nicely and looking green again. And here is an example of a stem-like succulent, which is commonly known as a pickle plant. And when you look at this closely, these are actually not thorns, but the leaves. Quite interesting. And then there's also the common aloe plant, which I think everyone would identify as a succulent, not a cactus, but does have little thorns on there, so don't prick yourself. And then this angulata is also considered succulent because of the thicker, juicier leaves, even though obviously it is not necessarily a desert plant. But this will help give you an idea of what you would consider succulent versus a cactus or a tropical plant. Now, I gotta tell you real quick, I know at the beginning I talked about succulents that I killed, and I've killed a good number of them. And I think mostly it was because I overwatered or I didn't provide enough light. And most of the time it happened towards the beginning of my houseplant collection, but I think even now there's still some plants that I struggle with, one of them being the string of pearls, as I kind of already talked about. That plant just doesn't like me, but what are you gonna do? You practice, you learn, you move on, you try new things. But I think once you start to really get the hang of how succulents live, then it becomes a little bit easier to take care of them. But don't be afraid of them. But at the same time, I would not call them a beginner plant. I would call them a good practice plant. That makes sense, right? But drop in the comments anything that you've experienced with succulent plants, or anything you've learned, any tricks that you have, successes. I would love to hear what has helped you keep your succulent plants alive, why you love them. Just tell me all of it. I just want to hear. I just want to know. I guess I'm nosy like that. Thank you again so much for watching. I really appreciate everything, all the likes and thumbs up and whatever is there. And I will see you guys next time.
Bye!